I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. In this episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we have a truly unique guest in the collapse-aware community and conversation around the world. Glenn Albrecht has been a highly regarded professor of sustainability in Australia for decades, but his real jewel in his crown of achievements, as far as I'm concerned, is his coining of numerous terms that come close, far closer than any other language that I've heard. Specifically in English, we have such a deficit of words, of a vocabulary with which we can describe our leaning into our daunting future full of predicament and collapse. This is an extraordinary conversation with Glenn Albrecht. All right. Welcome to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. This is Monday, October 18th on one end of the phone, or on the Zoom line. And I believe it's Tuesday, October 19th on the other end. Is that right, Glenn?
That's exactly right. So I already know what you're going to say to me.
Well, we'll get there in just a moment. So I just would like to do a very brief introduction, just for the folks who have been watching this podcast for quite some time. You'll have heard me kind of complain quite a bit about how there just isn't a sufficient language for us to lean into this daunting present and even more daunting future that we're facing. And while I've had the pleasure of doing some interviews with a gentleman that I've known for quite some time, Herb Simmons, about his kind of dictionary of the apocalypse, if you will, and I'll be having Herb on again soon. It's been only in the past year that I've really come to do some deep dive into the work of our guest today, Glenn Albrecht. And I've really got to say, Glenn, I'm very, very excited about this conversation today. You've just really taken it to a remarkably heartful and even soulful level in your blending of philosophy and of obviously a deep somatic experience, direct experience of being connected with Earth and with some amount of psychospiritual practices, which perhaps we can ask you to share a little bit about, what historically brought you to this synthesis, this place of literally creating language in a place where we so desperately need it. So we'll be talking, as I mentioned, to Dr. Glenn Albrecht today. And I also want to introduce someone who's been on the Poetry of Predicament before, and I also mentioned him quite a bit, a fellow deep adaptation personality or contributor, and that's Terry Rankin. And Terry is also someone deeply steeped in philosophy, far more than myself, and that's one of the reasons why he's here is, there's I think just such an apparent overlap, in Terry's passionate descriptions of Glenn Albrecht's work, and this just would be a wonderful episode of the podcast. And so here we are, it is happening. So now we are all visible on the screen. We can now see Glenn Albrecht, and welcome in your caffeinated and early morning state. And there's Terry on my screen on the upper left. And really just thank you both, Terry, for your idea of making this happen and your passion to bring in each of the elements that I've already mentioned. And for Glenn Albrecht, I just, you probably heard it already in my introduction, just have a real soft spot in my heart. And it's just an honor to meet you. I just appreciate the artfulness with which you've generated your body of work. It's been very moving for me to, go layer by layer into becoming familiar. So
Thank you for that, Dean.
yeah, my pleasure. Terry, I'm wondering if you would like to just take it from here in terms of just getting the conversation rolling, asking the first few questions and so on. And yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Dean. Let me just kind of add on to your introduction, kind of a tweet-sized CV, a tweet-sized resume about Glenn. And this is easy information to find. It all comes right out of Wikipedia for the most part. Your background, Glenn, is professor of sustainability at Murdoch University in Western Australia. I think you retired from there in 2014. You're an honorary fellow in the School of Geosciences at the University of Sydney. Your most recent publication, which I just started reading, is Earth Emotions, New Words for a New World, published May last year by Cornell. It's already
2019.
Yeah, 19. Oh, yeah, I misread it. You're right. I'm sorry. Thank you. And it's being translated into the French now, right, already. So,
and Spanish.
Yeah, those are the academic credentials for those of the listeners and watchers who may really be tied up in that sort of stuff. So having said all that, I'd like to kind of just go ahead and start things moving on the philosophical track, if I may. Let me say that I am not an academic philosopher. I did a PhD program but didn't get the degree. I did all the studies. I got a master's in philosophy of science and logic primarily, and stayed in that interest. And my PhD research that I didn't get the degree for was all in artificial intelligence, philosophy of the science of AI, which was fascinating then and remains so. So what drove all that, though, was a love of logic and a love of language. So Wittgenstein, as a philosopher of language, and certainly one of the brightest stars in that galaxy, is kind of where I felt an affinity for when I saw Solastalgia is the first word of yours that I ran across. And it was somebody else using it, but they were using it, I think, fairly correctly. And I think that's the one you're, quote, best known for so far, anyway.
Yes.
And it's been used in Lancet as a clinical term. The Western world in America is still trying to put words around it, like eco-anxiety, eco-depression, climate stress, all of this. So just to kind of kick things off, would you talk about how you came up with that term, that neologism? I love the fact that you just won't take Orwell's Newspeak 1984 linguistic disaster. You will just won't take that line down. If you have to, you'll make up one of your own. And I really admire that. So talk about just that first seminal notion of solastalgia for a moment, if you would.
Sure. And I can preface that by saying, I do appreciate Wittgenstein's work, and the limits of my language are the limits of my world is one of the standard lines from Wittgenstein that I think people may have heard of. I have my own take on it, which is that if you expand those limits, you begin to expand your world. And so part of the creative side to my work as a transdisciplinary philosopher is to think about, well, what's missing in our language as our world is changing? If there's something missing, is it important? That's obviously the first test. And then subsequent to that, is it trying to say something that other people are already experiencing but don't have a language to express their thoughts and their feelings? So it's partly the creative tension that I'm interested in, and creating a space where people see more than they had previously. And so that's expanding their world rather than limiting it. And there's also a genuine academic, I guess, or serious side to it, which is that this world is changing so rapidly that it's no wonder our linguistic ability to explain, describe, and share that transition, those rapid transitions that we're all experiencing, that our language, a bit like the law, it's going to take a long time to catch up, and it needs people to really begin to make inroads into that workload. So that's my general position on language and its attempts to, describe, clock, locate, whatever you want to describe it as, the process of the unfolding of reality. Now, solastalgia. Well, so it comes from my background as a, growing up in Perth, Western Australia. I was a nature-loving boy. Looked after the class reptiles, amphibians, and that sort of thing in the aquarium, and kept my backyard full of tortoises and snakes and birds. So I was a classic nature boy. And growing up in Western Australia also breeds a kind of isolation, because Perth, the city where I was born, is the most isolated capital city in the world. So you have to think for yourself as well. So I probably developed a very early ability to not worry too much about what the rest of the world is thinking, and to just make an effort myself to comprehend what's going on. And in terms of Western Australia, particularly nature, it has one of the highest rates of endemism in the world for both plants and insects, or plants, insects, and other animals. So there is a point to that creative effort in Western Australia, because what is present there doesn't exist anywhere else in the world, not even in Australia. And so there is that, it kind of breeds a sense of, you've got to make an effort to understand your own place. So that was built into me by growing up in Perth. It's by no means exclusive to Perth, but I think it's a kind of heightened awareness that this place is not just special in a trite sense. I had to create a word. I called it endemophilia, the love of that which is endemic to your region. I think that was built into me as a child, and as I matured as an adult, I began to realize that I actually had something within me that needed explanation in the English language, which simply wasn't there. So that background made it easy for me to really develop a sense of place, a sense of belonging. My identity as a person was tied to these peculiar and special places. And so as I matured, I went through philosophy, and I wanted to be an ornithologist initially, but I ended up becoming a philosopher. So swapped ornithology for ontology, but that's another story. It was when, with my wife and my stepdaughter and two large dogs, we travelled from Perth on the west side of the continent to Newcastle on the east. In order for me to complete my PhD studies, unfortunately in Western Australia, my supervisor became gravely ill and couldn't continue with his work, and I had to find another supervisor, and there was one that fitted the bill perfectly in Newcastle in New South Wales, on 4,000 kilometres on the other side of Australia. So we drove across, camped in tents, well, living in a caravan park for a while, and then finally settled in the town of Newcastle and began to create a new life for ourselves. My interest in birds, of course, meant that I was constantly discovering new avifauna, new birds on the East Coast that I'd never seen before, new landscapes. Everything was new, so it was just a great joy to immerse ourselves in this new landscape. And it was different to Western Australia, the climate, everything, but there were certain elements of it that were similar to Western Australia, and others that were radically different. And one of the things that I've always been interested in is the history of ornithology. And in Australia, that means you study the work of John Gould and his wife, Elizabeth Gould, who was a hugely talented artist of the bird world, and interested in art. And we had the opportunity to buy an original lithograph from John Gould's Birds of Australia, and it was a regent bowerbird. And on the back of it, I read the notes that came with the page.
Wow.
And it was, he collected the bird in Newcastle in New South Wales while camping on an island at the mouth of the Hunter River, which is the river that runs through the valley and comes out at the port of Newcastle. And on further investigation, we discovered that he and his wife actually lived for a short time on Elizabeth Gould's brother's property in the Upper Hunter. So a couple of hours inland by car from the port of Newcastle on the coast. And then it turns out they were here for months. They collected a lot of the specimens that later became part of the Birds of Australia. And both my wife and I were very keen to go up to the Upper Hunter and try and relive the experience of the Goulds. And to do that, you've got to drive this 2 hours inland. And that's where I discovered that the black coal mining of the Upper Hunter was totally obliterating the landscape that the Goulds so eloquently described in 1839, 1840. And so 150 years later, if they were to visit that landscape, it would be an alien one for them. And yet they described it in such wonderful terms that I had in my own mind this vision of well, some people call it the Tuscany of the South. These rolling, beautiful hills, a rich and fertile valley, people growing food. I was also aware of the Wanneroo people and their connection to that valley for tens of thousands of years. So I had this image of this wonderful landscape populated by people from, in the layers of tens of thousands of years. And what I discovered was a moonscape, a place that had been obliterated by black coal mining. You call it surface mining. I think we call it
mining.
Pit. I guess the terms differ all over the world, but it's scouring the surface of the earth, digging the coal up, and then exporting it to power stations in the rest of the world. So this open cut mining was it covered hundreds of square miles. So it was nothing but a shock to my psyche to really discover that my image of what the place ought to look like had been transformed, terraformed, literally, by this massive industry. So I felt this deep emotional and spiritual blow to my psyche when I witnessed it. And I was also, I was a person reasonably well known for being interested in environmental issues. And not long after that visit, that shock to my psyche, people from the Upper Hunter who were experiencing the direct impacts of coal mining were ringing me at the university saying, look, can you help us? We're fighting some of the biggest multinationals and government forces on the planet, and they're just obliterating our lives. So I thought, well, actually, this is something that an academic should have some interest in. It's a community-driven research project. So I was able to collaborate with a couple of my wonderful colleagues at the University of Newcastle, which is where I was based at that time. And we started to think about, well, what is the psychological, emotional impact of this large-scale coal mining on the lives of people who are directly experiencing it? And much to my amazement, there was very little published on the direct experience of the obliteration of your loved home environment. So that shocked me into thinking, well, how come the English language doesn't have a word to describe that feeling? It seems to be one that's universal. It's also one that goes back in time from, at the very least, colonial times onwards and the Industrial Revolution. So for 300 years, we've missed a word that poets and others have written about as a kind of melancholia at the loss of your home and your lived experience of that loss. And I thought, well, this surely deserves further investigation. And so I looked at similar kinds of words and how they describe the world. And the one that was closest was nostalgia, created by Johannes Hofer in the 17th century. And I was quite amazed that Hoffer's, I call these terms psychoterratic, psyche, mind, and terratic of the earth. So nostalgia was a psychoterratic concept, probably one of the first shared internationally. And it was the homesickness that soldiers and other people felt when they were absent from home and wished to return. And so it was that feeling of sadness about the gap between where you were and where you want to be, your home, that he created, that neologism, nostalgia, nostos, to return home.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, this is very close to what I want, but these people that I'm dealing with, and indeed my own position, was that they're in their home, and their home is leaving them, both literally and metaphorically. And this is a new space that deserved, what I thought at the time was, a strong and carefully considered attempt to describe that space, an emotional state where you're in your home and your immediate home environment is being desolated, literally and metaphorically. And so solastalgia, the loss of your solace, that which you loved from your home environment, was created to describe that space. The soul also comes from the soul of desolation, which has connotations of isolation. And the algia is not the medically defined algia of pain, it's the pain of our emotional states. And there are three different kinds of algia in Greek, and there's the pain, there's sorrow, and sadness, and those elements are combined in the original nostalgia in the same way that I've combined them in solastalgia. So there's a neologism that can be used by the people of the upper hunter to explain their own emotional distress, share it with others. So that started in the year 2003 when I created the term, and it's had a career since then. So it started from zero, and we're now talking about something which has some credibility and it has been shared internationally and in many different languages. So the French now talk about solastalgie, which is their attempt to put into their language and their context the exact same feelings that I thought were legitimately connected to the state, this emotional and psychic state I called solastalgia.
Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, I expected, when I asked the question, I expected a nice, rich story, but wow, that really kind of puts it in perspective in a way that is just stunning. And it prompts me to ask at least one question, maybe two. In just having started your 2019 book, the weaving of the indigenous place into this story and into this fabric, how did that begin in Western Australia, and how did it carry through to Eastern Australia, and what were your connections to those indigenous places and the people who had them and lived them?
Look, that's a convoluted story, and I'll try and make it as brief as possible. But in Western Australia, I'd have to say that my own home state, having been colonized by mainly, the British, and it's a very British town is Perth, that there was an element of racism built into the culture of Perth, the city. It's strongly European, English, suburban base. And the view that, the Noongar people, that's the name of the tribes of Western Australia, and their relationship to landscape and place, and even the name of the Swan River, which is the British name for the Belia. I mean, I grew up having no knowledge of Noongar culture. I had very little knowledge of the names that were trumped by the British when they arrived. Everything had an Indigenous name. And it wasn't until I became a late teenager that I began to realize that there was another narrative, another history of Perth that had been obliterated. And I needed to become aware of that as I matured and started thinking about philosophy and the meaning of life and all that. And that had been sharpened by the fact that, I mean, I'm of mixed origins. I'm like Irish, English ancestry from my mother's side in Perth, and her family were based in Manjimup, which is about 2.5, 3 hours south of Perth, in very rich, densely forested country. But my father was born in Sri Lanka, or Ceylon, of Dutch, Portuguese, and Sri Lankan origins. So I'm quite dark. And so as a kid growing up in Perth, my Portuguese, Sri Lankan ancestry meant that I was very different from other kids.
Yeah.
And so, one of my nicknames was Darky.
Yeah, a little on the shady side there. Yeah.
There was one Aboriginal term, which was a term of abuse. The settlers called Aboriginal people booms, and that was a term of deep and hurtful abuse. So that was another one of my nicknames. When I was playing sport, if somebody wanted to put me off my game, they would hit me with the racist card. So I grew up in a way with sensitivities about racism, which were quite different to the other kids in my primary school or my high school.
Right.
So there was that behind it. Coming across to the other side of Australia and settling in Newcastle, I actually decided to make good my lack of knowledge of the Indigenous history. So I deliberately started to do the full environmental history of places, so the geological history, the Indigenous history, and then the European colonization and thereon, and put the full story together so that we, the stratigraphy of life is not just 300 years old. It's tens of thousands and then millions of years old. And so my ignorance was gradually overcome with just my own effort. And the other thing was, when I started the research on Solastalgia with my colleagues, Linda Connors, an anthropologist and now retired professor of anthropology at Sydney Uni, Nick Higginbotham is a social psychologist, and we collaborated as a team to do these interviews. And one of our interviewees was a Indigenous man from the Upper Hunter, and the name of the clan, the group, the tribe up there is the Wonnarua. And he said when interviewed, and I remember it clearly to this day, that he and his colleagues, when driving in their territory, would often avoid going past any of the mined areas. And that meant to make diversions of hundreds of miles in order not to see the country that they were tied to being destroyed by the open pit, open cut coal mining. And he said that it makes him wild, in inverted commas, in the sense of so emotionally disturbed by seeing his country being blown up for coal that he couldn't bear looking at it. And so, when you have someone telling you that emotional experience of seeing their country, and the word they use for their bioregion is country. And so it doesn't mean nation state, it means a bioregional cultural region. So to see his country being destroyed by this massive terraforming industry and polluted by massive coal-fired power stations, that to me was a lesson in what does it mean to have emotional and psychological ties to your place, and how does it impact on your sense of place. Now, I don't wish to speak for Indigenous people because I'm not a Wonnarua descendant, I'm not an elder, I don't have any authority to speak on their behalf. But I have noticed that Indigenous artists and Indigenous scholars have taken up the concept of solastalgia to help them explain the deep distress that they feel when they're still, their country, their their place is still being destroyed by multinational mining, by urban development, by grand scale agribusiness, you name it. Their country is still being, colonized and torn apart. So that's something which I think connects me strongly to an Indigenous worldview. One is that I feel their sense of outrage about racism, and the other one is that their world is one that we should understand to the nth degree, because they passed one of the biggest sustainability tests that you can possibly undergo, which is that Indigenous Australians have been here on this continent for a minimum of 60,000 years, quite possibly into the 100,000 plus. And that makes our effort to try and destroy ourselves in only 300 years as a colonial power in Australia, just mind-bogglingly stupid that we could get ourselves in a position where we ignore a culture that was successfully attuned to its own support environment for thousands of years.
And they already had it right. They had it right.
They obviously had something right, didn't they? So we need to learn more about how to get that relationship right. And that's where the environmental relationship to nature thing comes into it, that having passed that test of time, they've got something to tell us that we simply either don't know or refuse to even listen to learn. So that's
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt.
That's my answer to your question.
Yeah, it's a great answer, and it's astonishing how much I'm discovering about common ground that we share. I have the same Irish English background. Irish Rankin and Arnold are my mother and father branches in the family tree, and I grew up on the western slopes of the Appalachians in Kentucky,
right,
which is a coal mining hell on earth.
Yep.
And I had a chance. I traveled around. I worked for IBM for a long time, and I got in the IT industry, and I traveled around away from Kentucky for like 35, 40 years. And then I had a chance to go back to that same western Cumberland Gap region of the Appalachians that I grew up just 10, 15 miles out of, just where it starts sloping out to the plains.
Yep.
And I had the same Solastalgia experience.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were whole mountaintops leveled and then pitted into hundreds and hundreds of feet below the relative surface around it for and they had started triggering little earthquakes. And that fault, whichever it is that runs up and down the Appalachia, I can't think of the name of it now, but it is a fault, just like the San Andreas on the west coast for the Rockies. They had awakened it with their fracking.
Yeah.
And I was talking to a guy who had been there all along, and he took us away from our work for a day to just kind of give us a show of the area. And I was just gobsmacked, to borrow a British word, with the Solastalgia of it. I didn't have the word at the time, and I'm so grateful that I found it with you. But I want to go back. You mentioned the Industrial Revolution as kind of a tipping point into that colonial destiny, which I don't dispute for a nanosecond. And it to me, it goes back a bit further. It actually goes back to the Enlightenment. And there was a split right there in the Enlightenment where, well, then it was the formal spirituality of organized religionist institutions, but our natural spirit connection to nature and the world and to one another also started going down the tubes when that was exactly what wasn't supposed to happen.
Right.
It was the age of rationalism, right? The age of rationality. And Dean and I have been, are you familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist?
No, I'm afraid not.
Master and the Emissary. Well, Dean, you do a great job of summarizing what the Master and the Emissary is about. And it ties in so nicely and tightly with the things we're sharing here in common. So, Dean, you want to kind of bridge us into that?
Yeah, I'd love to. I hope you don't mind, Glenn. Both Terry and I have been kind of building up a little cue card set to propose some other aspects of our world as it's showing up now that we were hoping you'd help us cue us or prompt us into some more creation of more new vocabulary. And
I'll do my best.
Okay. I've got this body of work that I'm working on, and the elevator pitch for it is that we're offering transformative support and resources to people bravely facing human-caused collapse of Earth and human systems. So your new vocabulary is just an incredible fit for these people at every level that they might come, any level they might come into this work, from the very first introductory level to the people who've been around this collapse-aware conversation for decades. And one of the simplest questions that I keep asking myself in order to prompt this kind of new looking is, if I imagine that I've got a Greta Thunberg in my life, that if there's some young girl that is so sincere when she comes to me and asks, all the adults here have known for more than 40 years what's going on and the damage that we're doing, and that yet the only thing that's occurred in response is an acceleration and intensification of every measure of that harm. What's going on? What is there something evil in human beings, or what is causing this? How could everyone have done this? So that's the essential question in the little imaginary scenario. In order to get myself away from my default way I be as truthful as I can when I imagine answering this imaginary Greta in my life. And if she catches me on a bad day, within a minute or so of starting to answer her question, I'm into blaming and shaming large swaths of humanity. And the word evil probably shows up somewhere around minute number 2. This is, again, on a bad day in this imaginary response to this question. So in order to find at least slightly more mature, responsible, or at least thoughtful response to this imaginary Greta, I've been really in search of what are some of the more empowering ways of framing the human condition that could start to answer the question, how could we have gotten ourselves into this existential predicament in this short a time? And this guy, Ian McGilchrist, that Terry was just asking about, has done an extraordinary job of, he's a psychiatrist, and he's also a research doctor in research in the very kind of studies that one would need to dive deep into in order to bring the quantity and quality of data that he's got to support his work. The essence of his work is, again, in just answering the question, what on earth could get us here? How on earth could we justify for ourselves what we've chosen and what we've created? And he's basically saying that there is a remarkable number of remarkable reasons why we have hemispheres in our brain, and there are actually a remarkable number of attributes to each of the hemispheres, very different than the pop psych left hemisphere, right hemisphere, feminine, masculine, that whole thing. And he's basically saying what we find ourselves in now collectively, which, by the way, these hemispheres are obviously very active in the description of our individual lives, but just as applicable at the level of nation states, global expressions of humanity, and so on. And his assertion is that we've been run by, both individually and collectively, we've been run by the wrong hemisphere for hundreds of years now. And that's what's gotten us into this existential level predicament. And again, the very short version of the distinction between the two hemispheres, the one that should not be running the show, that is running the show, is notoriously narrowly focused, notoriously binary in its thinking, zero sum in its thinking. I've either apprehended that food and I'm eating it now, or I haven't yet apprehended that food, and so on. The other hemisphere, so this would be, I'm now describing the right hemisphere, which does show up in the left hand and so on, and obviously the opposite for the one I just mentioned, is the one that has a far broader view. And it is also the one that brings us context and relationship and the implicit and metaphor. And there are a number of your interviews that I've been watching recently in which you get to a place where you're starting to describe with almost a dreamy quality in what you're describing when you describe your relationship with music. And something that you're appreciating. So you might tell a brief anecdote about that. That's very much what Ian McGilchrist does when he starts to talk about this right hemisphere. It's in the right hemisphere's appreciation and knowledge and experience of metaphor that he starts to express, like, this is what has us, by the way, one of the few things that this right hemisphere doesn't do so well is it doesn't have the immense access to language that the left hemisphere does. The left hemisphere is our verbal center. It is the one that is always representing us when we're doing what I'm doing right now. So thank you for listening to all that. I'm sorry to be taking up this much time, but I found it equally valuable to your creating these new terms for the world. In what Ian McGilchrist has brought us is that we have disconnected from and actually suppressed into a far secondary position our ability to see and experience the world in relationship. It would start to make sense how we've gotten ourselves into this predicament when the left hemisphere, the one that is running the show, is the one that is the perfect fit to the descriptor of the capitalist system, the predatory capitalist system that really all it can see is what's in it for me. I'm either going after it and getting it, and I've got it, and it's now mine, zero sum, and so on. And it has no ability to see something like the commons or a sense of communitas, a sense of the interrelatedness of all things at any level, whether it's between people or with the earth. So again, thank you for sitting through all that. And why I particularly wanted to ask you this question is, have you, can you imagine with us a little bit here, and perhaps you'd be kind enough to just kind of keep this in your back pocket as something to think about, can we come up with a term for our forfeiture, or more, I think it's more accurate, this taking away of this vitally important aspect of being human beings, that which has us relate with other human beings, with the earth itself, and so on, that gives us these implicit senses and these brilliant and deep connected realizations with our relationship with all aspects of life. would it be out of line to say that all fits in with solastalgia, or is there another term we can come up with to be able to, the way I summarize it is we've literally been disconnected from our primary sources of both meaning and relationship as human beings. For me, it really calls out for a term all its own. And I'm curious if you have any reaction to all this.
Look, I think I resonate with it strongly, and I can do so without having to worry about my left or right hemispheres. You know,
yeah, great.
They obviously have been well described by in McGilchrist. I kind of have a more holographic hypothesis view of how the brain and mind works, but you know, that's another debate in another context. But in Earth Emotions, the book, I try and simplify this for my readers by just saying, well, look, that the history of the conflict between these forces of destruction and the forces of creation are ancient. They're built into the structure of our Earth, the solar system, the cosmos as we know it. This building and destroying is just typical of everything that's going on. And so our emotional makeup must in some way be a reflection of that conflict between the forces that build and the forces that destroy. And often in the act of destruction, there is an act of creation at that moment as well. And so as a result, I create the choreography of the book is the fight between the terraforans and the terranascient people, those that build and those that destroy. And I try and build the Earth Emotions story as one, there's the whole set of emotions tied to the destruction of the Earth, and there are a whole set of emotions tied to its nurturance and the communitas, as you so eloquently described it. So I build that all the way through the book. So the negative emotions that we feel, solastalgia being one of them, there are plenty of others, and I've created more, and I'm still in the process of doing that. I've created terra fury, which is earth anger. So I've gone beyond feeling a sense of grief and melancholia about it to this is really pissing me off. You know,
Yes.
I have now got to the point where no longer do I have a soft emotional reaction, where soft is in inverted commas. I'm wanting to throw bricks through the windows. But, you know, so there's a stronger response to solastalgia.
Yes.
So the terraforans of the world are now in charge. There's a conflict between the terraforans as earth destroyers, like fora in the plant world means destroyer. There's a disease of plants called phytophthora, which is a fungal disease. Well, phytos is connected to the plants, fora is destroyer. So there's a fungus called a plant destroyer, and it's destroying the forests of Australia as we speak. And so I thought that this idea of that which destroys deserves a nice global term of its own. Mm-hmm. So that's difficult, and I won't bother doing that with you now. I can provide resources and what have you. I've got a glossary in at the end of the book, Earth Emotions, which helps. But this battle is one that's ancient. It's one that all cultures understand and have gone through. Mm-hmm. Traditional or indigenous cultures have actually got it built into their cultural belief systems. Mm. And they have words and terms to describe this cosmic and human struggle between the forces that build and the forces that destroy. And as they say in the classics, to cut a long story short, as a species, we've been successful largely because of our terranascient or earth-creating capacities. As a species, we would have been snuffed out tens of thousands of years ago, if not millions of years ago, as Homo, the genus, if we were essentially earth destroyers, destroying ourselves, self-destructive, selfish. So there must be within us the struggle, and you're right, and I agree with McGilchrist and virtually thousands of other commentators on our current predicament, which is that yes, we, in terms of complexity theory, we're at a classic tipping point where if these forces that destroy continue to rule for much longer, we are, as they say in the philosophical circles in Australia, in deep shit. So as a result, we must also, in order to have these negative earth emotions, there must be deep within us, and E.O. Wilson and others have speculated on our biophilia about, in order to feel a sense of loss, there must be deep within us a sense of this, the value, the sheer importance of these opposite connections to nature, those that build, those that create, those that deliver genuine growth, which is maturation, education, life cycles. All of those sorts of things are examples of growth in human terms. For growth to become metastasizing, for it to become essentially consumptive and extractive, is clearly something that all other animals do. We all consume, we all extract. But for humans to do it on this gigantic, gargantuan scale, titanizing rulers, that's, if there was a wrong path taken, it was taken not only at the time when our brains began to think about the rationality versus other more selfish paths, but also with the Industrial Revolution. It's just a story of our technological capacity to do things on a gigantic scale, and it's now global. So for one species to change the atmosphere in 300 years, it's a pretty big effort, really. Not many, termites control the atmosphere as well, but humans have done it on such a scale that we could bring about the apocalyptic ending that many contemporary writers and fiction writers talk about. So this battle between good and evil is old. It's told in many languages. I've just created another contemporary language in which we try and sort it out in global terms. At a psychological, psychosocial level, one of the good things about this story is that the terraforans, the evildoers, as Bush Jr. would describe them, they fight not only good things, but they fight each other. They're inherently destructive. So give them enough time, they'll destroy each other, but we don't want them to destroy the opportunities for the nurturers, the terra nascent, those that create. We don't want them cutting off those options. So that is why this tipping point is so critical at the moment. Why Glasgow in a week and a half is critical. Why Greta Thunberg is correct when she says that adults are stealing the future from their own children. She's on a moral high ground that cannot be argued against. There's absolutely no counter to the kind of moral argument that she has. And so I think I'm just slotting a new narrative into an old story that has many different cultural nuances. It's now global, so that puts it into a new context, and that's why the subtitle of the book is New Words for a New World. I'm actually looking at the world as a place where many of our past constructions, many of our evolutionary advantages have become not redundant, but they've become dangerous in the sense that they may well have been appropriate at a time of scarcity when hunting and gathering had formidable forces opposed against it. Starvation, warfare, and a whole lot of other things were life-saving, and we succeeded as a species. And there's nearly 8 billion of us, so clearly success in inverted commas has been achieved. But success at the expense of the rest of life has now been revealed, I guess, through not only the mass impacts on human life and all other forms of life, extinction being one of the worst impacts, obviously, but also there's this whole idea that we need a different vision to drive our future. And this is where the science of symbiosis and where this concept I've developed of the Symbiocene, an era that we can create for ourselves in relation to the rest of life, where the positive earth emotions, those things which are the opposite of the algas, the things which we must have within us, otherwise we wouldn't be feeling unease or distress or discomfort about the loss of landscapes, the loss of species, the feelings of discomfort when the pace of life is so rapid that we never settle. So I see the story that I'm telling as having it's a drama. It's like a Greek tragedy, but I don't want it to be a tragic ending. I want the terraforans to run away as the terra nascent tribes and united forces of the earth are yelling, "Terra leben," let the earth live. You know, we actually need a motto to help us see the value and the sheer creative excitement of defeating these destructive forces. And not only, I mean, this is where I'm critical of some aspects of deep adaptation and other positions that say we can critique what's going wrong, we can emotionally try and deal with that, but we don't have a vision of the future. I want to give Greta and her generation, which I call Generation Symbiocene, such a wonderful vision of the future that you want to be in it immediately. And then once you're in it, you'll never want to get out of it. It's offering the opposite story to the one that is unfolding in the name of the Anthropocene. So that's, and the science of symbiosis now says that this is not just utopian or euphoria, you know, some drug-soaked vision of the future from an aging hippie. We've got some really strong science that's telling us that the evolution by symbiosis is at least as important as Darwinian evolution by natural selection. Symbiosis is how the world of life interrelates, and we've learnt that the micro world, for example, our microbiome, actually runs our moods, and it doesn't run them in the sense of it's in control, but it has a profound influence on our blood pressure, our ability to sleep, our emotional states. And so we're beginning to appreciate that at the micro level, symbiosis is at least as important as competitive, survival-orientated, large-scale Darwinian evolution. And so the weaving of the new science of symbiosis with the older stories of our so-called competitive, nasty, selfish, brutish, Hobbesian natures is at least a good battle between one kind of science versus another. But I think the logic or the logician, the conceptual thinker in me says, look, it's the symbiotic worldview that has to win out if we want life to continue. The Darwinian one, as misinterpreted by neo-Malthusians and Darwinians of various sorts and selfish gene people that don't even understand Richard Dawkins, those people have got a vision, an ideology, which is powerful. It's powerful enough to get us to where we are now, and it's powerful enough to destroy us. So no argument from me on that. I'm marshalling what I would hope is a science-based, equally and more powerful opposition. I want to give it a name. I want to give it a destination and a path, if you like, that we can go from where we are now to a life in the Symbiocene where a whole positive set of earth emotions can be re-expressed. So we may now have new names for them, but we've always felt them. But they've been taken away from us in this metastasizing cancer that I see as typical of the Anthropocene. Right. So I think my story is similar to the one that you were telling as an expression of Ian McGilchrist's work. I'm trying to do it through a conceptual and emotional story that has a happy ending, not because I'm an optimist, but because I think we can actually, as a species, do precisely what the shift from the Anthropocene to the Symbiocene entails. And there's a whole series of terms that I have for that. I mean, pedologia is one that I created this year to describe how it is that adults can, with a straight face, lie to their own children about their futures. So pedo related to children, lygia, an ancient derivation of to deceive or to lie. So I'm actually still working on the language that we need to describe what is actually happening now. So we have, for example, a minister for the environment at the level of the nation state, the Commonwealth of Australia, who, when told by the High Court of Australia that she has a duty of care to the children of Australia with respect to their life chances in the future, has flat out said, well, I don't care what the High Court said, I've just approved a new coal mine. The economy is more important than ethics, in a sense. And so she's a pedologist. And I've now got a term to describe how it is that a minister of the state of the Commonwealth of Australia can bald-faced lie to the children of Australia and tell them that, look, if you don't have food on the table and your parents have got a house and a boat and a caravan, you're actually in a better state if this mine goes ahead than if it doesn't. And I just think, well, how come we don't have a term to describe that kind of lie? Right. So I'm working on the language to describe the responses. Yeah, so when you asked me right at the beginning, does this language adequately describe what's going on now? No. Right. We need to keep working on this. This is a joint project. If you can come up with terms that accurately describe what is unfolding before our very eyes, you're doing the world a service, because we don't have the language. Other cultures don't have it either, because we've never been in this position historically before. Right. So it's no surprise that our language is impoverished.
Yeah. I think I saw on your website, it's in your name, but it's your Psychotheoretica website.
Yeah,
and there's an article there. Our Prime Minister President hates her own children. There's your pedologia, right?
Yeah, that's it. At that time, I didn't have that term. It's come to me as I've got more and more terror fury building in me. That why don't we have a name to describe these people? They're suffering from some kind of pathology of the mind, and why leave it up to psychiatrists to describe what's going on? We can all have a go at this.
Yeah, I like your terror fury.
Yeah, terror fury. Yeah. Well, just earth anger.
Dean can give you testimony as to how often. I mean, I've branded myself living in a rage of grief for the last 5 years since I learned about all this. Yeah. But I do want to pick up kind of with the Ian McGilchrist theme, because I used them in my own research. I simplified it, I guess. Hope I'm not oversimple. But the way I understood it was in terms of this being my sentient, sensory, sensate sense of presence.
Yep.
This being my sapient, analytic, logico-linguistic sense of what that presence is. Okay?
Yep.
And I will step further, because in his work and in, I don't know if you know Jill Bolt Taylor, neuroscientist, who wrote about she consciously went through her own cerebral hemorrhage and wrote about it and talked about it. And one of the points she made was what was obviously had happened to her was the corpus callosum connection between the right and left hemispheres had been thrown into complete dissonance. And so I started thinking, okay, that's interesting. And you mentioned finding that resonance, that harmony between I think what you referred to as the terraphoric and the terra nascent, finding some way to keep those in balance or in harmony or in resonance. Well, as I understand it, the purpose not only of the corpus callosum, but largely of the corpus callosum, is to be the conductor of that mental symphony, if you will, that takes the sensory inputs and puts them over here, and the sentient mind then says, okay, sapient brain, logico-linguistic messenger, take this. It doesn't. This side doesn't have the language, so it hands off this thing to the sapient mind to talk about and analyze and do math about, right? Well, now here's the question that got really just ignited my rage of grief. I did philosophy of science primarily through that whole philosophy trajectory from way back. And in my philosophy of science, I can't, especially once I got connected into this rage of grief about the catastrophe we're in the middle of, I had to ask myself, if science is mythologized culturally and mythologized socially as the zenith, the apex, the epitome, the pinnacle of rationality, right? How did we end up where we are? What's rational about where we are? Not one damn thing. You see what I'm saying?
Agreed. Yeah.
So I had to say, what would explain science remaining at that, apex predator position, and yet being such a predator in a zero-sum game that this is where we've ended up, on the brink of our own extinction by our own hand. And the only answer I could come up with, and I'm just running this by you out there to just kind of get your perspective on the same, how do you reconcile the irrationality where we are with the supposed rationality of science? To me, it only makes sense if somewhere along the line, at least between the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution to the present day, somewhere along the line, science became militarized for profit, which means science became indentured to capitalism as scientism, not generally rational science, science weaponized. I can't really put a better word on it.
Yeah.
Purely for profit. I mean, the biggest profit industry on the planet is weaponry, the arms race.
Yeah.
And so I sit pretty well with that explanation, So when I look at your what you call them, terraphorians and terranations?
Yeah.
Yeah. When I look at that, I'm going, man, is that the military-industrial complex going against the nonviolent civil disobedience? You see what I mean? So, does this make sense? I mean, it makes it.
Look, of course, it all makes sense, but the story behind it is incredibly complex. I mean, I'm profoundly influenced by writers and historians such as Carolyn Merchant, who wrote a book called The Death of Nature in the early 1980s. And in it, she accounts for how it is that we have created this destructive world order, and it's built on feminist philosophies. It's built on understanding mechanistic ways of thinking, the takeover of a mechanistic rationality. So the patriarchy is part of that story. There's obviously other elements of the story. I mean, if you read theologians like Lynn White Jr., you'll discover it's built into our religious foundations. Look, so that story is so complex that I couldn't rewrite it in Earth Emotions. I had to think of a shortcut. So I actually thought, well, let's just try and create a drama based around some simple, I know the terms are complex, but they had to have some kind of earthy meaning. And so I've given them those meanings. So what we've got, if we do the history of science, if we look at the history of many of our institutions that are now dominant, they have a colonial history, a race history, they have patriarchy, they have theological and religious elements. In science, there are, the mechanistic versus the organics, the Cartesians that hear the screams of animals as the sound of a rusty gate and all that kind of stuff. So that story is enormous, and it's all built into a conclusion, which is that we've created a culture, a technology, and an industrial society that has those elements as dominant and ongoing. We've now, using science, the very same principles, and Lynn Margulis, the great science champion of symbiosis, is another story that says that, look, the science has always been there, but it's been the science of interconnectedness, the science of community, the sciences of what I call the biocommunion, the community of life that unites all living things, not just humans. These are like rediscoveries. We've understood them in a kind of non-science sense in traditional cultures. We're now rediscovering them within modern life sciences. Where in McGilchrist's system is the gut brain, influencing what's going on in left and right hemispheres. The body and its relationship to thought and emotions turns out to be way more complex than a left-right brain divide. Our bodies are quorum sensing our external environment. Our bodies are connected to other bodies all the time. We're breathing in and out the microbiota of other organisms, which are changing our moods. That, when you pat the cat, you're not only getting a purr, you're quite possibly getting toxoplasmosis as well. So, these things are happening to us. And toxoplasmosis is a good case study in that there's an organism that can actually change your mind. It takes over many aspects of your conscious and subconscious thinking, and it's a parasite. So the idea that somehow, we live in this nice, neat world inside our heads is, as far as I'm concerned, part of the story, and a very important story. But the epigenetics, the epipsyche, that which is beyond the confines of our bodies and our brains, turns out to be a story of the interconnectedness of life, the ability of life to influence life. Now, that's where I'm interested. I don't negate or wish to diminish the contribution of those that are trying to discover the pathways and mechanics of the mind-brain. But what I see is the net result of this evolution are institutions, there are cultural traditions, there's language. And all of these things are products of evolution in a sense. They have a story that connects them over time. And it's important to know that. As I said, if you read people like Carolyn Merchant and The Death of Nature, you'll discover that, the Cartesian, mechanistic, reductionistic, patriarchal, aggressive worldview has a story that goes back a long way and finds its expression in contemporary societies. That, but also the idea that we are now, with science, we have a new science, relatively new. I mean, symbiosis was only created as a term in the 19th century. We are discovering new aspects of the intimate relationship between ourselves as organisms and other organisms, from micro to macro, almost on a weekly basis. There's some new discovery about what it is that we are that unites us as one life form with others. We've always known about the big ones because they're immediate and they're available to our perception. But it turns out the microcosmos, as Margulis called it, is either as equally important or more important than that which is visible to us. And so my story, I guess, is to say that we need to learn philosophically from this marvelous discovery, from the very earliest microscopes now to the ability to see what's going on at tiny scales within our own bodies. It's all a story about returning us to where we came from in an evolutionary sense, from the smallest organisms on the planet. And, they're either our friends or our foes. COVID's a classic case study in telling us that you ignore the microcosmos and it'll come and bite you on the bum. If you ignore the social aspects of being humans, you'll end up with the death rate of Texans because of COVID. In other words, there is a story about community. There's a story about selfishness, and it's being played out now by a disease which comes from a microorganism that none of us can see. Mm-hmm. So it's like, if we were to go back 1,000 years and we had a similar kind of disease come in and start wiping people out, we would have religious and spiritual explanations for what's going on. We now know what it is, how it's caused, how to treat it, how to vaccinate against it, and that is a scientific story. So what I'm saying is that it's not science versus science, or science versus non-science. We now have science fighting science. There is the reductionistic, aggressive, macho man view of science, and now we have a different view of science, which is either equally important or more important. I put the case in my book that it's more important because it has a future. The macho view of science has no future because it kills itself.
Right. Oh, wow.
And everyone else around it.
A self-terminating model is that
exactly.
side. I would just like, not that I'm equipped in any way to defend Ian McGilchrist to you or anybody else, but I can tell you that my experience of his work, you've just done a gorgeous job of synopsizing Ian McGilchrist's work, as far as I can see.
Yeah. Not having read a word of it, I was guessing, but really what I'm doing is trying to give you my version of what I thought you were giving back to me as a summary of his view. And if there's overlap and parallels, then that's great. Means we've got common ground.
They're all over the place. They're profound. I mean, just in listening to what you were just saying, Glenn, it's like watching two chromosomes come together and form a new entity. I mean, we are down to like the last 15 minutes, so I'm just going to have one last little say here. Glenn, what I find myself, especially in light of this conversation, resonating most profoundly and harmoniously with is your sense of the desperate need we have for a legacy, to pass on a love of wisdom and a wisdom of love, if you will, to pass on to this kid in this picture, who is my grandson, at birth. And that's my daughter, who's a millennial. So what legacy can I give them? And I think you've answered it with your Symbiocene. I really do.
Well, I hope so, because there's not a lot going around at the moment which offers a future for humanity which can be presented to young people, but not only young people. The Symbiocene is a generation that includes baby boomers like myself. We all have a role to play in giving back to humanity the opportunity to rejoin the rest of life. It's that separation or divorce, which I think is the wrong turn at Albuquerque, if you like. The reconnection is something which, if presented in the right way, could provide a sense of point and purpose to our intellectual activity, our creative work, our innovation, new science, everything that we're doing now can be replaced. I think of it more, it's not so much, just simply replaced in an instant. There is a process of some people might call it regeneration. I tend to think of it as a kind of substitution, that gradually we figure out how to substitute those things that we're doing now, which are toxic, which are short-term, which are evil, to cut a long story short. And they're either got to go, or we have to find benign ways of doing them. Yeah. To have the universities and education systems open to that path of creativity, discovery, innovation, that's not hiding in a cave somewhere. This is what I think Homo sapiens should be all about. We're finally going to use our brains to do something rather than simply blowing things up or extracting things. I mean, that's just really dumb. It's really hugely unintelligent what we've done in the Hunter Valley or Appalachia.
Yeah, so the sapiens becomes a misnomer pretty quickly.
Yeah. Well, I want it to actually go back into our name as a species and have it mean something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would, just my last comment here, and I don't mean to be glib, but I would sum this up as you having taught me insight into what it means to say, we've been looking for love in the wrong places long enough. How about we start looking for love in the right places?
That's exactly right. Well, it was Rachel Carson who said that, I think she was quoting an economist or a futurist by the name of Jean Rostand, who said we have an obligation to endure, this idea that we've got something to pass on also gives us point and purpose. We're trying to help the innocent and non-consenting to enter a world which is better and has a future and, is exciting, creative, interesting, zero unemployment, etc., as our obligation to the future. And that's exactly what Greta Thunberg has said, that you have an obligation to us and you're not fulfilling it. And this is where, we have to get back into this real battle that we're in at the moment. We have to convince ordinary men and women on this earth that we're in this conflict, this battle, and B, that only one side will win. And that's the side which is nurturing, which is creative, which is innovative, which is giving us a genuine future. There's no other way that I can put it.
Well, Dean, it's over in your hands, man. My brain is popcorning, so I can't really.
Okay, so I just would like to put a plug in for what this work is that Terry and I are doing in what we call our community of practice, the portion of my body of work where a number of us who are just really committed to being on this path and realizing it in our own direct experience, bringing our life challenges to one another on a weekly basis and comparing notes about how we can embody truly new possibilities. And I'm really pleased to add your body of work to Ian McGilchrist and a couple of others, that really the challenge of putting together this work is to create a series of distinctions and practices that people can get as direct and immediate an experience of a truly new possibility or a new insight along the lines of what you've been laying out for us this entire conversation.
If I may, Glenn, the community of practice he's talking about just recently hit a threshold, kind of a tipping point. And one of the key things that we identified in facing that tipping point was we got to find a way to speak the same language. Right?
It's pretty important.
Yeah. So that's why this makes such good sense.
And to have a felt sense of that which we've been, all three of us, talking beautifully about. But as I'm sure you know, Glenn, it sounds like you are deeply involved with getting this into people's experience, not just their understanding, but into their experience. That's what's needing to happen. So I guess what I'm saying is it is a pleasure, it is a privilege to be able to include your body of work right next to Ian McGilchrist and Bill Plotkin and Francis Weller and a number of other people who have in their offering of their body of work something that is ripe to be just massaged into practices that people can then take on if they choose. If this is an emphasis that they personally are wanting to build out, that they can take that new felt experience into their family, into their neighborhood, into their organizations, and share with other people. And it's I can really get your excitement. I can feel the contagion of your excitement. You know, some in the doomer world would call this hopium, but there's a way in which I have gotten all the way along in the many interviews I've seen, the recordings of your earlier interviews and in this one. There is just an apparent sobriety that is really important in my hearing of you, in my feeling of you. I don't go well with the kind of intoxicated, self-absorbed hopium, the folks who want to fluff up some positive, hyper-positive view of the world. There's a very distinct difference in what I hear you laying out. And for that sobriety, I'm really appreciating this conversation, hearing you share with that.
Well, thank you for that. And one of the things that I'd like to add is that the artistic and creative world have really taken on board many of my own linguistic creations. So if you look at, say, Solastalgia and art, there are now thousands of exhibitions and creations that are connected to that concept.
Right.
And as I've created others, I've found that the artistic world, which includes music and as well as the poetry, dance, you name it, the arts world, there's a gradual coming together of that creative community, responding to both the negative and positive need to have some kind of clarity of conceptual understanding, and also to educate, to respond, to shock, to give people some sense of, look, get out of your complacency. I mean, that's in some respects one of the things that I'm doing, is that I'm being deliberately disruptive. I don't expect all of my concepts to work, but I expect all of them to disrupt. And so as a result, I see the responses now, and I guess from 2003 to now, where I was doing nothing in this field, to now being, I guess, retired in order to do this work, because I couldn't do it in the university system. They don't have brownie points for what I do. I had to get out.
Right.
I retired from a tenured professorial position in order to do this work. Yeah. And so as a result, there's nothing in it for me financially. I'm totally committed to this vision of a Symbiocene future, and the work, the practical and creative work that's required to get there. So I'm now writing a book on the Symbiocene, which I hope, I get sufficient inspiration and energy to complete before I fall off my perch. So that's what I'm doing. And I take heart in the fact that other people in totally different domains are also seeing the need for this practical response to the linguistic, conceptual word world, which is way beyond hopium. It's gone into, what people are actually doing, creating, moving, shaking things that are connected to some aspects of my work. So I feel that this is an important, it's not a validation of what I'm doing. It's an important recognition that other people are on this path. Yes. And that the more of us who join and unite, the stronger we're going to get. And that's another aspect of my work. I'm trying to create the language of solophilia, the working together with like-minded others to achieve social change. It's a cultural and political concept.
I said I wouldn't say anything else, but I lied, as always. I think I've hit on the perfect thing to kind of put a ribbon on this. Glenn, I'm going to put my avatar up for a second.
Oh, yep.
That portrait, which is a pretty good likeness. I don't know if you know the cartoonist Mr. Fish or not. Dwayne Booth is his actual name.
I think I've seen Mr. Fish cartoons. There's one that I have a connection to.
Yeah. I happen to work with him. He and I've got him on the hook to do some illustrations for some of my writing. And he did this for me as a favor, as a portrait. But he lets me, I support him on Patreon, and he lets me send him a word every month. Guess what word I sent him about 6 months ago?
Well, it could have been Solastalgia.
It is. Let me show you his picture. It's a quick sketch, I mean, it's not a detailed drawing, but it really nails it, I think.
Well, I'm still looking at Mr. Fish.
I know, it's coming. Hang on.
Oh, I was going to say,
share my screen to get
I can't tell the difference between you and Solastalgia, and that's a worry.
Here it comes.
Oh, well, there it is. Okay. So it's, I guess, a glass or bottle half full, is it?
Well, look at the very bottom of the bottle.
I see the fish.
Okay, there you go.
Yep. Yeah, there's the lived experience of negative environmental change, which is a precise definition of solastalgia. Thank you.
I just thought you'd enjoy that. Speaking of the creativity and the art side of solastalgia.
So, yeah, it's fantastic. Well, thank you, and thank Mr. Fish.
I will. Would you like to have it? I have rights to distribute it as I please.
Look, I'd love a copy of it. That'd be great.
I'll email one to you.
Thank you.
All yours, Dean. I will.
All right. All right. Glenn Albrecht, thank you so much for taking this time to speak with us. And I hope against hope that I can ask you to come back. I would say approximately 6 months from now. I'm predicting having a handful of real-time, no kidding practices that we could introduce you to and ask you to participate with us a little bit. That the kind of thing that would give us a shared sense, direct, palpable sense of some number of your terms in terms of how we can actually embody some of these. And it would be a joy to have you come back and join us for some of that, almost playtime, really, at that level.
I think it'll be serious work, as well as hopefully some creative good fun.
Yeah. So thank you so much for taking this time.
Look,
and for your
it was a pleasure, and lovely to directly connect virtually with the two of you. And I think obviously there's so much more we can share, so that the solophilia can continue.
Thank you so much.
See you later.
Thank you, Glenn. Be well, sir.
Yep.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue into the Sea. Also available on our website, www.livingresilience.net, is a wide array of articles, online learning series, arranging group and individual resilience coaching, and sign up for our every other Tuesday free support group that we call Safe Circle Calls.